Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable: sleep, or more accurately, why medieval people treated sleep like a weird part-time job. You're about to step back into a world where bedtime wasn't peaceful. It was segmented, slightly religious, and almost definitely itchy. You probably won't survive this one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where this sleepy little community reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging through a medieval village after sundown. The streets are quiet, the air is cold, and you smell at least 3 different types of smoke. No electricity, no streetlights, just the glow of a tallow candle in someone's window and the occasional whinny from a horse that probably knows more local gossip than the church clerk. In this world, sleep is not an 8-hour slab of unconscious bliss. That's a modern invention, brought to you by coffee-fueled capitalism and Thomas Edison's overachieving light bulbs. Back then, sleep came in 2 acts. It was called segmented sleep, and it wasn't just a peasant thing, it was everyone's thing. People went to bed not long after sundown. Candles were expensive, oil lamps were fire hazards, and honestly, everyone was tired from trying not to get the plague. After about 4 hours of first sleep, the weird part happened: they woke up on purpose. This in-between phase, called the watch, was about 1 to 2 hours long. Historians still debate whether it was triggered biologically, your circadian rhythm reacting to natural darkness, or socially, because people just liked an excuse to check their goats. During the watch, medieval folks would get up, stoke the fire, pray, and sometimes do chores. Not intense ones, no one was hauling hay bales at 2 a.m., but you might mend a sock, reread your psalter, or quietly resent your relatives. This period was also prime time for intimacy. Monks even wrote manuals suggesting that between first and second sleep was the ideal time for marital relations. The body is well rested, and the mind tranquil. One scholar put it, which is the most polite way of saying you're too tired to start an argument. People didn't find this pattern strange at all. It was part of the routine. Some wrote letters during the watch, others composed poetry. Chaucer drops casual mentions of it. It wasn't insomnia, it was intermission. What's especially fascinating is that modern science kind of supports this. In the absence of artificial light, humans tend to naturally drift into this 2-phase sleep. A few studies have recreated these conditions, and participants often revert to segmented sleep within a few weeks, which is either reassuring or mildly alarming, depending on how badly you need melatonin to function. But back to the watch. You're up in the middle of the night. There's a low fire flickering in the hearth. Maybe you're whispering to your spouse. Maybe you're alone, mending your hem by candlelight. Outside, it's quiet except for the distant sound of a barn owl or some truly suspicious wind. And this was when the spiritual stuff came out. People believed the veil between worlds was thinner during the watch. Ghost stories, divine visions, demonic visits. This was prime ghost o'clock. If something was going to go wrong in your house, it wasn't going to be during second sleep. It was now. And yet, it was kind of cozy. If you got up and all was quiet, if the fire was still crackling and nobody had stolen your chickens, you might feel a strange kind of peace. A short, warm moment in an otherwise unpredictable world. Eventually, people would settle back down into second sleep. lasting until dawn or whenever the first rooster gave up on being subtle. This was the deeper sleep, less interrupted. And if you were lucky, you didn't wake up with a back full of straw and a raccoon under the blanket. This whole idea collapsed with the Industrial Revolution. Once gas lamps and factory whistles took over, the concept of waking up in the middle of the night became inefficient and vaguely embarrassing. Suddenly, sleep was something you were supposed to do for 8 unbroken hours, preferably in one of those Victorian beds that looked like haunted wardrobes. Segmented sleep faded into obscurity. It became one of those things historians stumbled across in old texts and thought, wait, what? But in many ways, it made sense. You go to bed with the sun, wake up in the middle to process your day, connect with your household, maybe commune with your goat, and then finish your rest. It was adaptive, it was natural, and maybe, just maybe, it's still in us. The next time you find yourself wide awake at 2:30, blinking at the ceiling and thinking about taxes or what you said at that one party 4 years ago, maybe don't panic. Just say, yes, the watch has begun, and go light a candle, write some thoughts down, or reorganize your sock drawer like a medieval poet. Don't worry. Second sleep is still coming. You're not falling asleep on a cloud tonight. You're lying on what medieval people generously called a bed, but it's mostly straw, burlap, and a faint smell of last harvest. There's something poking your shoulder blade, and you hope it's just a stick. Welcome to the golden age of discomfort. In most medieval homes, especially among peasants, the bed was less a piece of furniture and more a suggestion. A straw-stuffed sack called a pallet was the standard. It wasn't soft, it was better than the ground, soft. You might have some coarse linen if you were lucky, but more often it was just straw piled in a corner, occasionally flattened by goats, children, or emotional exhaustion. If you had a little more coin or a family member who was handy with wood, you might elevate your pallet on a frame, not for style, just to avoid waking up eye to eye with a rat. Elevation also reduced draftiness. Thatched roofs were not exactly climate control systems. Wind had VIP access. And then there were the bedfellows. The phrase sleeping alone wasn't just rare, it was suspicious. Families slept together. Kids, parents, sometimes grandparents, all nestled into one scratchy pile. If it got too warm, you could always roll into someone's elbow. If it got too cold, well, there was probably a dog nearby. In fact, this was strategic. You weren't looking for comfort, you were looking for body heat. Humans are basically medieval radiators. Having a few nearby was essential, especially in winter, when the only insulation between you and frostbite was last summer's hay and someone's snoring uncle, and personal space never heard of it. There were no king-size beds with memory foam. You had 6 square feet, and 3 of them were someone else's knees. People learned to sleep in defensive formations facing outward, curled inward, or with one leg strategically blocking a sibling. Now, the bedbugs, or as medieval people knew them, life. If it crawled, it was probably in your bed. Fleas, lice, mites, and the occasional bold mouse made guest appearances nightly. This was such a normal part of sleeping that people had special tools for nitpicking, literally. If you were rich, someone might even do it for you. And yet, somehow, this was considered an upgrade. Compared to the outdoors, with its wolves, bandits, and emotional coldness, a pile of infested straw inside 4 walls was luxury. Meanwhile, in noble households, beds were something else entirely. Imagine a towering wooden frame, carved like a small ship, with curtains, canopies, and maybe even a mattress filled with feathers. Sounds great. Right. Except the feathers were often lumpy, uneven, and possibly re-gifted from your aunt's expired goose. These beds were status symbols, not comfort machines. The grander the bed, the more important you looked alive or dead. People included beds in wills. You didn't just inherit land. You inherited grandma's mattress, complete with structural sag and spiritual baggage. Even in castles, privacy was scarce. Servants might sleep on benches nearby. A noble couple's bed was public enough that political negotiations sometimes happened there. Yes, your negotiations for land ownership might take place while sitting beside someone who just drooled on the pillow. One particularly uncomfortable reality: these beds were rarely changed. Linens, if you had them, weren't washed often. Laundry was labor-intensive, and soap was about as gentle as gravel. Instead, they used perfumes or herbs to mask the odor. Medieval Febrezes, if you will. Let's not forget the noise. In a communal room, whether peasant cottage or noble chamber, you didn't just have one person snoring. You had a full ensemble. Parents muttering, kids dreaming loudly, and someone inevitably grinding their teeth like they owed the hay pile money. Sleep in this world wasn't about silence. It was about endurance. You closed your eyes and hoped for the best, knowing that by dawn, you'd be sweating, itchy, and slightly bruised from bumping into your cousin's knee. Historians still argue over how restful this kind of sleep really was. Some suggest that people simply didn't expect deep sleep every night. Others think they were too tired to notice. After all, most folks were up at sunrise, worked until sundown, and ate just enough to not collapse. But there's something oddly comforting about the resilience here. You didn't need luxury. You needed a warm body, a dry roof, and a prayer that the rat in the corner wasn't interested in your foot. Occasionally, the church weighed in. Monks and religious scholars wrote that too much comfort in bed led to laziness or, worse, temptation. So even if you had the means to sleep better, guilt would keep you awake. And the irony, people still dreamed. Despite the straw, the bugs, and the roommate situation, medieval sleepers described vivid, detailed dreams. Perhaps it was because they weren't overstimulated before bed. No screens, no sugar, no one more episode, just candlelight, chores, and the slow drift into segmented, scratchy oblivion. So next time you toss and turn in your expensive mattress with its cooling gel, memory foam, and blackout curtains, just remember you're still doing better than 14th century Walter, who woke up spooning a goat and wondering if the thing crawling on his leg was symbolic or just another Tuesday. Clothing designed for sleep in the Middle Ages was, how do we put this gently, not really a thing? If you're imagining luxurious robes or cozy flannel pajamas with little medieval sheep embroidered on them, stop. You slept in what you wore all day. And what you wore all day probably smelled like whatever you did all day, which was often mud, animals, or penance. Most people didn't have a wardrobe to change into. Clothes were precious, handmade, and worn until they could no longer hold themselves together without divine intervention. So when bedtime arrived, you didn't slip into anything more comfortable. You just collapsed where you stood, ideally near straw. Even wealthier folks, who owned more than one set of clothes, didn't necessarily change before bed unless the clothing was uncomfortable, muddy, or actively on fire. The exception nobles and clergy who had specific night garments, long, loose tunics made of linen or wool. These were nightshirts, and they were not cute. They looked like oversized tea towels and probably itched. And underwear don't count on it. In many regions and periods, underwear was more of a sometimes situation. The fewer layers you had to manage, the fewer you had to wash. And let's not get started on medieval laundry routines, unless you're emotionally ready for lye soap and riverside blisters. The nightshirt, if you had one, was all-purpose warm, modest, breathable in theory, but likely to catch on fire if you got too close to a candle. Fashion and safety were rarely on speaking terms in the medieval bedroom. Then there were social expectations around what you wore in bed. For women, especially married ones, it was often expected that you keep your head covered. That's right, even while sleeping. Many women wore a head wrap or a coif. Why modesty, mainly? But also because insulation was bad. Lice were real, and head coverings kept both your scalp and your reputation intact. Historians still debate how widespread this was. Some sources suggest it was mostly for married women in urban or noble circles, while others point out that peasant women probably gave up on modesty the moment their roof started leaking. Men, meanwhile, could get away with more freedom, but there was still etiquette to consider. If you had to answer the door or attend to a sick animal at midnight, you'd throw on a cloak or at least tie your tunic. The unwritten rule was, don't show up at someone's hearth half-dressed unless you want to be the subject of village gossip for a week. Of course, in families or shared homes, nobody really expected privacy. Everyone saw everything eventually. Entire households, including children, often slept in the same room. Personal space was a myth. If you rolled over and flashed a knee, you just hoped no one was awake enough to care. Still, appearance mattered especially to the higher classes. Nobles sometimes had their nightshirts embroidered, not for comfort, but for status. Imagine sleeping in something with your family crest stitched across the hem. That's not loungewear. That's bedtime branding. One weird little fact. In some households, particularly wealthier ones, servants might help dress and undress their employers for sleep. This sounds luxurious until you realize how awkward it would be to have someone standing by while you fumbled with your nightcap and tried not to trip on your own dignity. Nightwear wasn't just practical, it was a signal. Wearing a nightshirt and cap in public, say, while answering your door, was like hanging a "Do Not Disturb" sign on your head. It said, I am not available for business, conversation, or surprise plagues. Please come back during daylight. And yes, sometimes people were buried in their nightclothes. If someone died in bed, and many did, there was a decent chance they were interred in whatever they were wearing. For peasants, that meant the same threadbare tunic they'd worn for days. For nobles, it could be ceremonial sleepwear because nothing says eternal rest like one final fashion statement. There's even a debate among historians about the hygiene of sleeping in daytime clothes. Some argue that people layered outer garments, which they removed at night, while others suggest that underwear or base layers were worn non-stop. What we do know is that bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and everything you wore eventually took on the scent of permanent medieval. Still, despite the lack of modern cleanliness, people made efforts. They might air out their clothes, use herbs to freshen them, or even sprinkle garments with rosewater if they were wealthy and felt fancy. But there was no such thing as sleepwear as self-care. You slept in what you had, and if that happened to be itchy wool, well, sweet dreams. Oddly enough, some rituals around sleep clothing became cultural markers. For instance, in certain European towns, showing up at a window in your nightshirt during an emergency was taken as a genuine sign of distress. It was understood that if you hadn't bothered to dress, things were serious. Like, the village is on fire, serious. Modern pajamas, those matching sets with drawstrings and elastic, are a relatively recent invention, appearing around the 19th century and catching on slowly. Before that, sleepwear was just clothing that happened to be less likely to have buttons. So next time you slip into a soft cotton tee or that worn-out pair of pajama pants you refuse to throw away, be grateful. You're not sliding into a sackcloth tunic covered in lye residue and existential dread. And your head doesn't need a wool cone to stay respectable. That's progress. Friends, one unflattering nightshirt at a time. Let's talk about hats. Not the ones you wear to the market or to avoid eye contact with your neighbor after accidentally insulting their pig. No, we're talking about the most medieval hat of them all, the nightcap. It's long, it's floppy, and it looks like a wizard got halfway through putting on a sock and gave up. In the Middle Ages, the nightcap wasn't a quirky fashion choice. It was an essential item of sleep survival gear. If your home was made of stone, wood, or any other material guaranteed to trap zero heat, then your scalp was constantly in danger of frostbite. And since heat escapes fastest through your head, nightcaps weren't optional. They were your bedtime helmet against the elements. Most nightcaps were made of wool or linen, sometimes both. Wool for warmth, linen for breathability. If you were poor, you used scraps from other garments. If you were rich, your nightcap might be embroidered. Because nothing says elegance like sleeping with a crest on your forehead. The classic look, a long, pointed cone that hung to one side. In some cases, absurdly long, like trip over it while going to the outhouse long. Why the pointy end? Historians still debate that. Some say it was purely aesthetic. Others think it was functional, like tying the end into a knot to keep your ear warm or to wrap it around your neck like a budget scarf. And let's not pretend this was a purely male accessory. Women wore nightcaps too, though theirs were more modest, often styled like coifs or head wraps. They covered the hair completely, both for warmth and to preserve social respectability, even while unconscious. It wasn't about vanity. It was about rules. Some regions even required married women to cover their heads 24/7 as if God couldn't tell when you were napping. But nightcaps weren't just insulation. They were social signals. If someone answered the door wearing one, it was basically a medieval way of saying, I am not emotionally prepared for visitors. Also, it's cold. Showing up in your nightcap was the equivalent of texting sleeping. Now, in wealthier homes, nightcaps could get weirdly fancy. Gold thread, intricate patterns, fluffy edges. Imagine trying to fall asleep with something on your head that says, "This is my bedtime tiara." Some nobles even had nightcaps dyed specific colors to reflect their family status. Deep red wealth, blue prestige, beige you ran out of dye. One odd historical account mentions a nobleman who had a different nightcap for each night of the week, embroidered with the days in Latin, the medieval version of a weekly sock organizer. We'll never know if this was practical or just an early form of bedtime peacocking. And nightcaps weren't always quiet accessories. In urban centers, they signaled your social availability. If someone in the neighborhood saw you in your cap out the window, they knew you were off duty. No more bartering, no more gossip, no helping the neighbor chase their sheep again. You were in the zone, the sleep zone. There's even some evidence that people judged you based on your nightcap. A well-made cap suggested responsibility, stability, and spiritual awareness. A ragged one. Maybe you weren't managing your household very well, or your goat ate your good one. Either way, People noticed. Nightcaps were also practical when it came to bedmates and pests. With lice and fleas lurking in every corner of the medieval home, a tightly bound nightcap offered some protection. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. Kind of like wearing a hoodie in a mosquito swarm and pretending you're invincible. And in case you're wondering, yes, people often slept fully clothed, nightcap included. This was not a brief moment of warmth before you stripped down for comfort. No one stripped down for comfort. Comfort had not been invented yet. You layered up, tied your cap tight, and hoped that sleep would arrive before the drafts did. Of course, there are always outliers. Some folks refused to wear nightcaps, claiming they were too itchy or that they made their dreams too loud, which probably just meant I don't want to talk about it. Others, particularly in milder climates, skipped them altogether and just wrapped their heads in blankets. But in colder regions, especially during winter, you were courting frostbite without one. And for monks, the nightcap was both functional and moral. Monastic orders valued humility and austerity, so nightwear had to reflect that. No fluff, no lace, no long floppy nonsense, just plain cloth, tied tight, a silent statement that even in sleep, the Lord is watching and he is not impressed with frivolous tassels. One academic controversy, whether or not children were required to wear nightcaps. Some sources suggest they did, especially in noble households. Others argue that kids were already bundled so tightly with parents and blankets that any additional hat would have caused spontaneous combustion. The truth, likely both. It depended on the family, the climate, and the availability of unchewed linen. Nightcaps persisted well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. They fell out of fashion once insulation and heating improved, and when hair started being styled more elaborately. Imagine spending 3 hours getting your hair powdered and curled, only to mash it under a sleep hat. Tragic. Still, nightcaps have never fully disappeared. They survive in cartoons, in Christmas tales, and in modern jokes about sleeping like Ebenezer Scrooge. But for medieval people, they were no joke. They were armor for the cold, shields against bugs, symbols of status, and declarations of domestic disengagement. So the next time you see a cartoon character with a floppy sleeping cap, remember that ridiculous hat once meant, "Don't talk to me unless someone is actively stealing the chickens." It's getting late. You're traveling cross-country by foot or mule, and you desperately need a place to sleep. You find a medieval inn, a warm, glowing beacon in a sea of mud and questionable life decisions. You step inside, exhausted and aching, and ask for a room. The innkeeper blinks at you and gestures toward a large wooden bed already occupied by 2 strangers. Congratulations, you've just booked a bed slot. Medieval inns were not private sanctuaries. They were human, stackable storage. The idea of having a personal room with a lock and key that was reserved for royalty, saints, or people traveling with way too many swords. For everyone else, you paid for a space in a bed, and that bed was likely already being used. These beds didn't have memory foam or ergonomic design. They had straw mattresses, creaky frames, and about a 50-50 chance of housing insects. And unless you arrived extremely early or had a minor miracle on your side, you'd be sharing with complete strangers, maybe 1, maybe 3, depending on how horizontal everyone could arrange themselves. This wasn't considered rude. It was just how travel worked. Inns functioned more like dormitories or way stations. The goal wasn't comfort, it was shelter. Shelter from the cold, the rain, and the occasional roaming thief with a goat in tow. Historians note that even in big cities like London or Paris, this bed-sharing system was the norm. Some inns divided beds by profession. You might find yourself curled up next to another carpenter, or perhaps a traveling friar with a snoring problem and an aggressively sharp elbow. Did people worry about safety? Of course. Theft was a real concern, but travelers had methods. Some tied their coin purses to their belts or even slept on top of their belongings, turning baggage into both a pillow and a primitive alarm system. If someone tried to sneak off with your bag, the resulting body flop usually woke you up. And yes, this arrangement led to some truly bizarre experiences. Imagine being a modest pilgrim from Norwich, trying to fall asleep while a merchant and a tanner argue about grain prices across your chest. You turn to your left, and someone you've never met is already drooling into the shared straw. You turn to your right, and another stranger is muttering in their sleep. You're the human sandwich filling of medieval hospitality. There are recorded efforts to make this slightly more bearable. Some inns used bolsters or wooden dividers between sleepers, not for comfort, just so people wouldn't roll onto each other. But even that was inconsistent. More often, everyone just agreed not to ask questions about who kicked whom during the night. And of course, gender separation was inconsistent. Some inns tried to keep men and women in separate sleeping areas. Others didn't bother, especially if you were married or pretending to be. Travelers were sometimes grouped by social status or religion, and sometimes just shoved wherever space allowed. There's even documentation of people lying about their profession just to sleep near quieter folks. No one wanted to be next to a guy who sharpened knives for a living and talked in his sleep about whispers from the blade. The only people exempt from this ritual were the extremely rich. Nobles traveled with entourages, private tents, and in some cases, their own portable beds. A few demanded private chambers if the inn had them. Others simply bribed the innkeeper to clear out a room if you were poor and that happened. Too bad. Off to the stable with the goats. Speaking of which, stables were often the backup lodging. If no beds were available, you could sleep in the hayloft, curl up near the fire, or try not to get trampled by an irritable mule. It was cheap, risky, and sometimes warmer than the actual rooms. And yet, this kind of sleeping arrangement built a weird kind of camaraderie. You weren't just enduring a bad night's sleep, you were participating in a tradition. Everyone had stories about strange inns, noisy roommates, or waking up next to someone they swore hadn't been there the night before. Academic debates continue about how common this was across regions. Some historians argue that more rural inns offered private sleeping corners with curtains. Others insist those were the exception. What's agreed on is that the concept of a private hotel room with crisp sheets and mints on the pillow would have been so alien it bordered on suspicious. There were rules, though. Unspoken, often ignored rules. Don't hog the blanket. Don't bring your livestock indoors unless you were desperate. Don't start arguments at bedtime. And most importantly, don't sleep diagonally. It was medieval etiquette at its most primitive. One lesser-known fact. Some towns had unofficial sleep spots for travelers who couldn't afford an inn. These were nooks in churches, barns, or the houses of locals who let strangers crash for the night in exchange for food, gossip, or small coins. Think of it as a medieval Airbnb with fewer amenities and more fleas. And while it sounds awful by today's standards, remember this was still an upgrade. Sleeping indoors on something softish, near a fire, and surrounded by walls was infinitely better than sleeping outdoors. The cold, the wolves, and the highwaymen made bed sharing with strangers seem cozy. So, The next time you find yourself frustrated by hotel keys that don't work, or neighbors who blast late-night TV, remember the medieval traveler, crammed into a lumpy bed with 3 strangers, a stolen blanket, and the faint hope that no one brought lice. In that world, a bad roommate was the least of your problems. The important thing was you weren't sleeping next to a goat. Probably, before sleep, there was always a moment of pause. A moment when everything went quiet except your thoughts, your creaky joints, and maybe the wind rattling through your very not weatherproof door. In this lull before sleep, people in the Middle Ages didn't just roll over and call it a night. They prayed a lot. See, medieval sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a spiritual cliffhanger. Every night, when you closed your eyes, there was a genuine fear that you might not open them again. Illness, fire, sudden divine judgment, any of these could snuff you out like your candle. So naturally, people got in the habit of preparing for bed the same way you might prepare for a long, dangerous journey, with rituals, prayers, and a whole lot of apologizing to God. Children were taught bedtime prayers almost as soon as they could talk. Not just sweet rhymes. Either we're talking full theological checklists, asking forgiveness, blessing the household, shielding the soul from demons, and making sure that if you did, in fact, die before waking, your spiritual paperwork was in order. One popular prayer went something like, "I lay me down to sleep and commend my soul to God to keep, if I should die before I wake." Yeah, that's not just a creepy nursery rhyme. That's a real medieval sentiment, comforting. Right, in many households, this routine was communal. Families would kneel together, say prayers aloud, sometimes even sing hymns. The idea was to ward off evil, not just physical danger, but supernatural threats. The night was seen as the devil's playground, a time when temptation and terror crept in on silent feet. People often recited psalms or passages from religious texts before bed. In wealthier homes, someone might even read aloud from a devotional book. These books were beautifully illustrated, filled with golden ink and tiny pictures of saints and angels alongside the occasional grotesque creature or marginal doodle of a nun chasing a snail. Long story. Medieval art was weird. Some wore blessed objects to bed's small crosses, relics, or even prayer beads tucked under pillows. Others placed herbs like lavender or rosemary near the headboard, believing they'd ward off bad spirits or help purify dreams. Holy water was sprinkled not just on babies, but also occasionally on beds. If your hay mattress started steaming, it wasn't haunted, it was just drying off. Even animals weren't exempt. People prayed for their livestock before bed. A healthy cow was not just a cow, it was milk, meat, and social standing. So yes, someone in 1342 probably did whisper, "God protect Bessie," before tucking in beside her. Historians still argue about the depth of these nightly rituals. Some believe that for deeply religious households, especially monastic ones, bedtime prayers were extensive, structured, and nearly mandatory. Others suggest that among peasants, these rituals were simpler, more instinctual, less theological, more like, "God, please let me survive another night without rats chewing my boots." One particularly strange tradition was praying against night hags. These were shadowy entities believed to sit on your chest and cause nightmares or sleep paralysis. It's likely this was an early explanation for actual medical phenomena, but to the medieval mind, it was very real. To prevent this, some folks slept with iron charms or knives under the bed, or hung protective herbs above the door, which, yes, probably made sleeping even harder. There was also a belief that your soul partially left your body while you slept. Dreams were thought to be glimpses into other realms, heaven, hell, or something in between. So saying a few prayers before sending your soul on that journey, just good spiritual hygiene. And then there was the practice of confession before bed, especially among monks and nuns. Examining your conscience was a nightly ritual. What sins did you commit that day? How many times did you think mean thoughts about Brother Thomas? Did you covet Sister Agnes's sandals again? It wasn't just about guilt, it was about cleansing the soul before slipping into unconscious vulnerability. Of course, this spiritual prep varied across regions and centuries. In some places, local customs influenced the rituals. Scandinavian Christians mixed Old Norse protections with new Christian prayers. In parts of France, people invoked saints specific to their region like Saint Blaise, protector of throats, and, apparently, snorers. And the church had a say in all of this. Sermons frequently warned against the dangers of unprepared sleep. Falling asleep without prayer was seen as both lazy and risky. You never knew when God would decide it was your time. Better to go out with a clean conscience and a whispered Amen. But even with all the spiritual caution, bedtime was still a social moment. Kids often curled up beside parents during prayer, learning by listening. Spouses held hands while murmuring blessings. It was intimate in a way modern routines rarely are. No doom scrolling, no late-night emails, just firelight, whispers, and the deep hush of a household surrendering to darkness. One quirky side note, some people even prayed about their dreams in advance, asking for guidance, protection, or inspiration. Certain saints were believed to send helpful dreams, while others could warn of coming illness or betrayal. So yes, if you dreamed about your neighbor's turnips, someone might try to interpret that into an allegory for sin. Ultimately, these nighttime rituals reveal how fragile and uncertain sleep once felt. Without science, medicine, or heating systems, the darkness was terrifying, and prayers were the medieval version of locking your doors. So next time you toss in bed at 11 p.m. and whisper, "Ugh, I forgot to plug in my phone," just know that your medieval counterpart was whispering, "Please let me wake up and not be haunted." Perspective. Close your eyes and imagine drifting off to sleep in the 1300s. Your feet are wrapped in wool, your head in a lopsided nightcap, and your dreams, well, your dreams are not yours alone. Because in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't just idle brain static. They were portals, warnings, temptations, and sometimes full-on theological battlegrounds. You weren't just resting. You were entering a realm where your soul might be tested, where angels whispered secrets, and demons tried to steal your virtue using your subconscious like a puppet theater. In medieval thought, dreams were deeply meaningful. They weren't random flickers of memory. They were messages divine, demonic, or internal, but always significant. Some dreams were thought to come from God, others from the devil, and some just from bad dinner decisions. Bread that's a little too old, that'll send you straight into dream limbo with prophetic overtones and suspicious chickens. Theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wrote about dreams with the kind of intensity most people reserve for taxes. Augustine classified dreams into 3 types: natural, caused by the body; spiritual, caused by God or angels; and demonic, well, you can guess. Your nightly visions could be used in sermons, shared in confession, or written in a prayer journal if you were a literate monk with an exciting subconscious. In some cases, entire court decisions were influenced by dreams, especially if someone important claimed divine guidance while napping. Historians still debate how much ordinary medieval people really believed in dream messages. Some say most folks took them seriously. Others argue it depended on the dream, like seeing a three-headed goat might get more attention than just dreaming your neighbor stole your bread again. What we do know is that dream interpretation was an actual profession. Medieval dream books called Somniale Danielis circulated widely. These were guides that decoded common dream symbols. Dream of flying, a spiritual awakening. Dream of teeth falling out, death is near. Dream of cats, someone's gossiping about you. Dream of naked dancing bishops, see someone immediately. One of the most well-known dream interpreters was Macrobius, a Roman writer whose dream classification system was still being copied and taught in the 12th century. He argued that dreams could predict the future if you knew how to read them. So yes, medieval people had their own version of astrology girlies. But instead of crystals, they had Latin. In monasteries, dreams were considered sacred territory. Monks wrote them down, analyzed them, and sometimes even shared them during morning gatherings. Not every dream. Of course, nobody wanted to hear about your "I forgot to wear my robe to prayer" panic dream, but the ones that felt profound, those were treated with awe. Some even believed that dreams could carry warnings from the dead. Ghosts of loved ones might appear with advice or unfinished business. This wasn't a spooky campfire tale, it was taken seriously. People prayed for guidance, lit candles for the dead, and occasionally left out food or trinkets just in case. Women's dreams were treated inconsistently. Some were seen as visionary, think of mystics like Julian of Norwich, whose divine revelations in a dreamlike state were revered. But your average medieval woman, her dreams might be dismissed as hysteria or temptation, depending on the content. Not fair, but very on-brand for the era. One peculiar belief held that the devil could enter your dreams and tempt you to sin. If you gave in, even just in your sleep, it counted. You could be held accountable. Yes, you could literally be spiritually fined for dream crime. That's like waking up guilty for cheating on a math test in a dream, and then confessing it during Mass. To protect themselves, people sometimes recited prayers before sleep, specifically asking for pure dreams. They also invoked saints known to guard the subconscious, like Saint Raphael, who was thought to guide dreams toward clarity and protect against demonic meddling. Because even in your sleep, you couldn't fully clock out of spiritual responsibilities. Even royalty got in on the dream game. Kings claimed to receive messages from God in dreams, usually involving victorious battles or divine approval for whatever nonsense they were about to unleash on the peasantry. This gave decisions a kind of holy legitimacy, because apparently I dreamed it was once an acceptable foreign policy strategy. A well-known example, King Henry II of England reportedly dreamed that St. Thomas Becket warned him of impending doom after his murder. And shortly after, things didn't go great for Henry. Coincidence, maybe. But back then, people were reading dreams the way we read news alerts. Dreams could also inspire art and literature. Chaucer's Book of the Duchess starts with a dream. So does Piers Plowman, a massive allegorical poem basically built on one long nap. Dream visions were an entire literary genre used to explore morality, politics, and sometimes just really weird metaphors about fish and sin. Weird fact: some people were known to act out their dreams, not sleepwalking exactly, but waking up and following what they believed to be dream instructions. One story tells of a man who dreamed he should dig in a certain field. He did. Found nothing. Dreamed it again. Dug again. Still nothing. On the third try, he hit buried coins. Historians suspect luck. Medieval people credited angels. Even the church treaded carefully. Dreams could be dangerous. Too much emphasis on personal visions could lead to heresy or social chaos. So while dream interpretation was encouraged in moderation, too much dreaming got you in trouble, especially if you started predicting things the clergy didn't like. So next time you wake up sweating from a dream about accidentally marrying a turnip or showing up to school in a chainmail bikini, consider this: in the Middle Ages, someone might have asked you, very seriously, if that turnip had a halo or a tail, and depending on the answer, you'd either be blessed or exorcised. The year is 1347. You've finished a long day of hauling firewood, cursing at turnips, and narrowly avoiding accusations of witchcraft. Now, at last, you climb into bed, except you're not alone. Lurking somewhere under the blanket is a pig, or maybe a chicken. Possibly both. Welcome to the medieval heating system animal proximity sleep. You might think this sounds unsanitary, and you'd be absolutely right. But to the average medieval family, sharing a bed with animals wasn't gross, it was genius. Homes were cold, drafty, and generally made out of materials better at leaking than insulating. Firewood was scarce, fireplaces inefficient, and winter did not care about your comfort. So the solution was simple: bring the warmth inside. Literally. People slept next to dogs, pigs, goats, and chickens, not as pets, but as tiny biological radiators. Pigs, in particular, gave off a satisfying amount of heat. Chickens less so, but they were small, easy to tuck near your feet, and surprisingly loyal until you tried to cook them. Dogs were the MVPs of sleep companions, warm, quiet most of the time, and willing to share space as long as you didn't steal the covers. This wasn't just a peasant thing, either. Even in some wealthier households, livestock might be kept indoors, especially in harsh winters or during periods of unrest. A cow in the hallway meant your family had milk in the morning. A goat near the bed meant you weren't freezing to death in your sleep. The practice was so common that entire sleeping arrangements were planned around animals. You might position the bed near the kitchen, where it was warmer. You might block drafts with hay bales, and you definitely made sure that if your pig was going to snuggle with you, it had at least been brushed once this year. There are accounts, real, documented ones, of people waking up to find hens laying eggs on their pillows or cats sleeping on their heads. The line between family member and livestock was, let's say, fluid. You named them, loved them, occasionally yelled at them, and then one day ate them. It was complicated. Historians still debate whether this kind of close cohabitation improved or worsened public health. On one hand, the extra heat probably saved lives during freezing winters. On the other hand, living with your pig was, shall we say, not great for hygiene. Disease spread quickly in close quarters, and animals often carried fleas, lice, and other unwanted guests into the hay. And let's not forget the soundscape. Livestock are not quiet. Chickens squawk, pigs snore, cows moo for reasons unknown. You might be half asleep when suddenly your bed quacks. Welcome to nighttime in a one-room cottage where you, your spouse, your kids, and 3 animals all share a space the size of a modern bathroom. Privacy, forget about it. Someone was always awake. Someone else was always snoring. And if you were lucky, the goat didn't chew your nightshirt again. In some households, livestock were even kept under raised floorboards for warmth, turning the bed into a kind of passive heating system with hooves. Now, this wasn't universal. In warmer climates, animals were kept outside unless needed. In towns, regulations sometimes prohibited livestock indoors for sanitary reasons. But in the countryside, it was the norm. And frankly, people got used to it. You didn't think, "This is weird." You thought, "That's Gerald the pig. He snores, but he's warm." There are even records of animals developing routines. Some dogs would guard the door until bedtime, then hop into place beside their humans. Cats, as always, did whatever they wanted, including sleeping directly on people's faces. Chickens liked warm corners. Sheep liked stepping on you before settling down. Everyone had their spot. And this wasn't just about warmth, it was about security. Animals could serve as early warning systems. A barking dog, a startled hen, or a suddenly nervous goat might alert you to intruders, fires, or supernatural visitors. Think of them as feathered and furred alarm clocks that sometimes pooped indoors. Oddly enough, this setup led to some interesting bedtime rituals. People might bless the animals before sleep, or thank them for their warmth. Some even said small prayers over their pigs or cows, not because they expected divine revelation, but because affection and dependence ran deep. These animals were part of the household economy and the bedtime routine. Academic arguments still swirl around just how cozy all this actually was. Some historians believe people genuinely loved sleeping with animals and found it comforting. Others argue it was a desperate measure born from poverty and cold nights. Either way, it shaped how medieval folks understood home, sleep, and survival. And here's a strange little detail: literary texts from the era barely mention the animals in bed. It's likely that it was so normal. It didn't feel worth writing down like today's equivalent of mentioning you brushed your teeth. If you grew up with a pig at the foot of your straw mattress, you weren't going to pen a dramatic essay about it. That was just Tuesday. There's even a legend of a peasant who refused to give up his pig during a cold snap, despite village pressure. When questioned, he said, "The pig does not complain about my snoring." Can you say the same, absolute icon? So while your modern mattress might come with temperature regulation, copper coils, and a 100-night guarantee, it probably doesn't come with a chicken named Agnes who insists on sleeping next to your knee. And that, my friend, is both a blessing and a loss. You rise before the sun in a stone-cold monastery, the scent of candle wax and damp wood thick in the air. You slept on a wooden plank with a blanket made of itchy regret, and your roommate, Brother Simon, snores in Gregorian chant. Welcome to monastic sleep, where comfort is a sin and rest is rationed like wine at Lent. If you think the average medieval peasant had it rough, the monks looked at that discomfort and said, "Hold my rosary." In the monastic world, sleep wasn't about relaxation, it was about discipline. To be a monk was to live in spiritual boot camp, and that meant denying yourself even the illusion of softness. First off the beds, or rather, the surfaces. Most monastic orders believed in the virtue of hard sleeping. That meant wooden planks or thin pallets, maybe some straw if your abbot was feeling generous. Pillows were discouraged. If your neck wasn't slightly bruised by morning, were you even repenting correctly in some stricter orders like the Cistercians, you slept fully clothed? Not for modesty, but because removing your robe meant you were getting too cozy with this world. Also, It saved time. Monks had to wake up multiple times during the night for prayer, and no one wanted to waste precious penance minutes putting on pants. That's right. Midnight prayer calls called matins and lauds were mandatory. The bell rang, echoing through stone halls, and the monks rose in silence, shuffled into the chapel, and began chanting psalms with bleary devotion. No snooze button. No, I'm too tired. God was always awake, and so, unfortunately, were you. The timing varied, but usually first prayer began around 2 or 3 a.m. That was followed by short returns to bed, then more prayers, then more duties. It wasn't just segmented sleep, it was shattered sleep, sprinkled with divine obligations and, occasionally, freezing toes. Why all this austerity? The belief was that comfort leads to temptation, and sleep too much of it was a gateway to sin. A sleepy monk might dream impure thoughts, miss prayers, or worse, oversleep and have to endure Brother Hugo's judgmental stare of eternal shame. So the logic went, make sleep uncomfortable, make sleep shorter, and the soul will stay sharper. Whether it worked is still up for debate, but the system produced centuries of highly devout people with chronic neck pain and astonishing mental discipline. Some monasteries had dormitories called dorter, large communal sleeping rooms where monks rested in rows. No curtains, no privacy, no walls, just you, the wooden slab, and the sound of 30 men attempting to breathe reverently. There was a strict silence rule, so even sneezes had to be discreet. No one wants to be that guy echoing off the chapel wall at 3:15 a.m. But not all monks slept the same. Different orders had different rules. Benedictines, for example, allowed for more humane conditions, thin mattresses, maybe even a pillow. Carthusians, on the other hand, often slept in isolation, in small cells, with bare essentials. Their goal wasn't just discomfort, it was spiritual solitude. They didn't just avoid gossip, they forgot what gossip was. Some monks tried to game the system. There are accounts of brothers who added extra straw to their beds when the abbot wasn't looking. Others leaned against walls instead of lying down, arguing that they weren't really sleeping, just meditating horizontally. One notable controversy among historians: did monks dream more vividly because of their sleep patterns? Some scholars believe that interrupted, austere sleep led to heightened subconscious activity, which monks interpreted as visions or divine messages. Others say they were just really tired. In fact, many famous visions recorded in medieval monastic texts happened during twilight sleep, those fuzzy hours between matins and the next bell. Monks reported seeing angels, demons, and symbolic beasts. Whether these were spiritual experiences or just the brain's way of begging for a nap is still hotly debated. Dreams were often shared in morning gatherings. If a monk had a vision, the abbot might call for interpretation. If the vision included fire or horses, it was probably symbolic of passion. If it included cheese, someone had been sneaking food after Compline. And while monks weren't supposed to get too attached to worldly concerns, they still found clever ways to improve sleep without breaking the rules. Herbal sachets, heated stones, extra layers tucked discreetly under robes, monastic hacks that made hard living just slightly less unbearable. It's worth noting that women in convents had similar sleep regimens. Nuns also woke up in the middle of the night for prayers, and they too followed rules about modesty, silence, and spiritual focus. Some orders even discouraged nuns from lying fully down, recommending a slightly upright position as a reminder of their constant devotion, because nothing says God first like semi-conscious spine damage. So, What did all this lead to? A population of incredibly focused, spiritually intense individuals who mastered the art of functioning on fragmented sleep, cold bedrooms, and zero caffeine. Okay, they had herbal infusions, but let's be real, it's not the same. Despite the harsh conditions, many monks wrote about their sleep with a strange tenderness. They believed the sacrifice was worth it, that the quiet, cold hours before dawn, those little slivers of half-sleep and whispered prayer, were sacred. And maybe they were. Imagine lying awake at 4 a.m., wrapped in your coarse robe, your body aching, but your mind still humming with psalms. Outside, the wind rustles the trees. Inside, the candle flickers, and in that stillness, you feel something ancient and profound, a peace not made of comfort, but of purpose. So the next time you curse your lumpy mattress or hit snooze for the third time, remember the monks. They didn't get better sleep, but they got something else entirely. Whether or not they wanted it is another story. It's a quiet night. You lie in bed, staring into the shadows where the firelight doesn't reach. The straw beneath you shifts. Someone snores. Someone else mutters in their sleep. And still, something's off. That nagging sense of unease isn't just paranoia. Because here in the medieval world, sleeping alone doesn't mean peace and quiet. It means something might be spiritually wrong with you. That's right if you weren't sharing a bed. People assumed the worst. Maybe you were sick. Maybe you were antisocial. Or maybe, and this was whispered behind hands, you were possessed. Sleeping alone was a rarity outside of monasteries or the incredibly wealthy. Most people simply couldn't afford the luxury. Beds were expensive. Rooms were shared. You didn't tuck in by yourself, you tucked into a social experience, whether you liked it or not. This communal sleeping wasn't just about warmth and space. It was about moral protection. Sleeping next to someone, especially a family member or a spouse, meant accountability. If you started mumbling demonic verses or twitching suspiciously, someone would notice. If you dreamed too dramatically, someone could wake you up. The shared bed was a kind of spiritual surveillance system. This idea went deeper than practicality. Medieval society believed that the night was dangerous, not just because of thieves or rats or freezing toes, but because your soul was vulnerable. Sleep was considered a near-death state, a liminal space where evil could creep in. Being alone during that time risky. In folktales, demons and spirits often visited people who slept alone. They'd whisper lies, induce nightmares, or try to tempt the soul away. One popular belief was that the devil preferred to attack the solitary people with no witnesses. A person waking up sweaty and disturbed, with no one nearby to verify what happened, was often suspected of spiritual wrongdoing. And if something did go wrong, if you had a seizure, a terrifying dream, or started shouting in your sleep, there were no second opinions. People might assume it wasn't illness, but a mark of evil, or worse, a sign that you were in league with it. Historians still debate how widespread this fear of solo sleeping was. In some regions, the belief bordered on superstition. In others, it was practical sleep alone. And if you die in the night, no one notices until the chickens start pecking your feet. There's even anecdotal evidence of people asking neighbors to sleep over during times of illness or spiritual stress, not for help, but for presence. The human body wasn't just warm, it was a kind of spiritual buffer, a way to keep the night's creeping dangers at bay. This cultural anxiety extended into architecture. In many homes, rooms were open, with multiple generations sleeping in the same space. The hearth was the heart of the household, and beds were grouped around it. Privacy, as we understand it today, didn't really exist. It wasn't desired. It wasn't trusted. Even children were rarely left to sleep alone, not because of attachment parenting, but because solitary sleeping could invite spiritual mischief. Some texts even recommend tying bells to children's wrists or placing protective herbs near their heads to ward off bad dreams or possession. Sage, rosemary, and lavender weren't just for cooking, they were the medieval sleep aid kit. This fear also shaped how people reacted to those who chose solitude. Hermits, recluses, and wandering mystics often lived and slept alone. While they were sometimes revered, they were just as often treated with suspicion. If you voluntarily isolated yourself, you were either incredibly holy or incredibly dangerous. And for women, the rules were stricter. A woman sleeping alone, especially if she was unmarried or widowed, could quickly become the subject of local gossip. Was she a witch? Was she summoning things in the dark? Why wasn't she under someone else's watchful eye? One weird belief from certain regions claimed that witches got their power at night, when they were alone and most open to dark influences. People genuinely thought that solitary sleep gave witches time to commune with spirits, brew secret spells, or ride off to midnight Sabbaths. So if you were a woman living alone, you'd better keep your windows shut and your nightcaps modest. Even in literature, this theme shows up. Characters who sleep alone are often marked as either tragically noble or morally questionable. The solitary sleeper is someone on the edge of society, either by choice or consequence. In one story, a man who builds a home and insists on sleeping by himself ends up being haunted until he relents and takes in a roommate. The lesson: even ghosts believe in sharing a bed. Of course, there were exceptions. Nobles, for example, sometimes slept alone for symbolic reasons. A royal bed might sit empty while a king was away, as a gesture of fidelity, or a chamber might be designated as a place for spiritual rest, where solitude wasn't suspicious, but symbolic of power and autonomy. Yet even then, servants often slept nearby, behind curtains, on benches, under the bed. You might technically be alone, but you were still surrounded by witnesses. This created a paradox: the desire for rest, the fear of isolation. People wanted to sleep, needed to sleep, but rarely did so without the silent awareness of being watched, not by malice necessarily, but by necessity. The fear of solitary sleep faded slowly, as homes became more spacious, and as religious fears evolved. People began embracing the idea of privacy. But echoes of that old anxiety still linger. The night remains a strange, liminal place. Even now, many people feel uneasy falling asleep alone in an unfamiliar house, or in a room that creaks a little too loudly. So if you've ever kept a nightlight on, double-check the lock, or turn the TV on for background noise. You're not being childish. You're just channeling your inner 14th century peasant who knew, deep down, that the dark was never really empty. It's the dead of night. You stir from sleep. The coals in the hearth whisper their last breath. And outside, the wind howls like a sermon gone off script. You stretch your legs, and that's when you hear it. A rustle, a thump, then silence. Congratulations. You've just survived another episode of the Medieval Night Watch. Contrary to what movies tell you, medieval towns didn't shut down neatly after sunset. The night was very much alive, just slower, weirder, and a lot more cautious. People moved through it with purpose and paranoia, And at the center of that uneasy rhythm was the watchman, or if you're lucky, several of them, wandering your town or village like half-asleep sheepdogs with sticks. Their job, keep the peace, or at least keep the chaos quiet enough that the mayor wouldn't get yelled at. Every town had its own version of a night watch system. In some places, it was a formal role, a paid position, complete with a badge and some kind of poking implement. In others, it was more DIY. Citizens were required to take turns patrolling the streets, not because they were skilled, because they were available and awake. Kind of. If it was your night on watch, you carried a lantern, a cudgel, and a deep sense of regret. You walked the streets in a loop, checked doors, and listened for anything suspicious: fighting, fire, or people doing unapproved witchcraft. If you found something concerning, you banged a stick on the ground, shouted an alert, or ran to get someone who could do more than bang sticks. Interestingly, this role wasn't considered noble or glamorous. It was mostly feared or resented. People bribed their way out of watch duty, faked illness, or just wandered off. And who could blame them? It was cold. It was dark. And if something did go wrong, you were the one expected to yell first and get trampled second. There were no radios, no phones, no emergency hotlines. The best you could do was yell until someone opened a shutter and yelled back. Medieval neighborhood watch programs relied heavily on vocal cords and light sleeping. One surprising detail, some watchmen sang. Not full songs, but short, rhythmic calls, kind of like audio watermarks. All's well, and the hour as past 3 was a common one. It served two purposes: comfort and warning. Comfort for citizens hearing it from bed, warning for anyone thinking of doing crimes in the dark. And crimes were a serious concern. The night belonged to thieves, drunks, and occasionally bored teenagers with torches. Break-ins were more common than you'd think, especially since doors were rarely locked with anything more secure than a wooden latch and a prayer. People leaned heavy on divine protection and community gossip to stay safe. Watchmen also looked out for fires. Chimneys were basically open flames inside your house. One bad coal, and you had yourself a neighborhood bonfire. So part of the watch's job was sniffing for smoke and waking people before everything turned to ash. They didn't always succeed, but when they did, they expected beer or baked goods in return. Heroism doesn't pay, but pastries help, of course. Night watchmen weren't saints. Some were corrupt. Some fell asleep. Some drank on the job. There's at least one record of a medieval town having to arrest its own watchmen for stealing from the very homes they were supposed to protect. A self-defeating security loop if there ever was one, and if you weren't in town in rural villages, the system was looser. You had local elders, sometimes an armed constable, and lots of dogs. Dogs were the rural night watch unpaid, underfed, and extremely effective. Nothing moved without them knowing. A goat sneezed. They knew. A mouse farted. They knew. A fox blinked in the wrong direction. They were on it. Now, if you happened to wake up in the middle of the night, which was common thanks to segmented sleep, you might listen for the watchman's voice. If you heard it, great. If you didn't, you might worry. You might get up. You might look out the window with a candle and pray you weren't the only one doing so. There's a certain eerie beauty to the medieval night watch. Imagine it a lone figure walking under the stars, his lantern swaying, breath fogging in the cold. The town asleep, the cobblestones echoing with quiet steps. Somewhere, a dog barks, somewhere else. Someone stirs, listens, and turns over in bed comforted, if not exactly reassured. Academic debates continue over how effective these watch systems actually were. Some argue they deterred petty crime and provided social order. Others believe they were mostly symbolic people trying to feel safer in a world that was inherently unpredictable. But symbolic or not, the system endured. Watchmen show up in court records, town rolls, and old laws. They were required to carry horns, identify strangers, and challenge anyone roaming the streets after curfew. And curfews were no joke. Being out too late without a good reason could get you fined, or at least chased by a man with a lantern yelling, "Halt," and tripping over a chicken. And yet, in all this, there's something profoundly human. The idea that even in a time before alarms and motion detectors, people still tried to watch over one another in the dark. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough. So the next time you lie awake and hear a siren in the distance or the hum of streetlights through your window, think of him, the tired man in the cloak with the sputtering lantern, whispering all's well into a night that might not believe him. You're finally drifting into that sweet, precious medieval sleep when thud, the shutters rattle, a baby wails, someone's goat panics. You bolt upright, heart racing, and realize it's not the devil, it's not a fire, it's a storm. Medieval people were no strangers to bad weather, but the experience of sleeping through a storm without insulation, weatherproof windows, or even glass was a deeply visceral ordeal. Your roof was straw or wood, your walls may be stone, and the wind had direct access to your eardrums. It didn't knock politely, it moved in. Imagine lying in bed under a thin wool blanket, wind slicing through every wooden plank in the house, the rain leaking through the thatch above you. If you lived in a thatched roof cottage and most did rain meant indoor drizzle, you might even position bowls, buckets, or the family's Sunday shoes to catch drips in the usual spots. Yes, this was so normal that some homes were designed to leak strategically. Lightning storms. Now those were something else entirely. Without proper grounding, lightning could strike your home and travel through anything: chimneys, wooden beams, even the metal on your cooking pot. There are tales of people being injured while sleeping because their bed frames touched a wet wall during a strike. Medieval lightning safety tips: pray hard and hope you're not the tallest object in the village. Thunder was more than noise, it was divine commentary. People saw storms as a form of spiritual communication. If the storm was fierce, it was interpreted as God's anger, or worse, a sign that the devil was nearby. Monks recorded storms in chronicles alongside battles and famines. Lightning didn't just hit the church steeple, it meant something, probably about sin. And the soundscape, let's just say white noise, hadn't been invented yet. You didn't have apps with gentle rainfall loops. You had actual rainfall, slamming into your ceiling like an angry mob of wet rocks. Winds whistled, trees groaned, and every creak of the rafters became a live performance of what was that noise, starring you and your rapidly escalating imagination. Now, if you lived near a river or on low ground, storms brought a special guest star flooding. Beds were elevated partly for warmth, but also because waking up in ankle-deep water was not as rare as you'd think. Some families kept planks or stools nearby so they could lift belongings off the floor. Sleeping with one eye open wasn't just for paranoia, it was for buoyancy. And while the physical risk was real, the spiritual anxiety was just as intense. People genuinely believed that storms weren't just weather, they were tests. A night storm might prompt impromptu prayers, candle-lit blessings, or, in some regions, ringing the church bells to ward off evil. Yes, that's right. During a lightning storm, ringing large metal bells. What could go wrong? One academic controversy surrounds this bell-ringing tradition. Some argue it was a symbolic act, meant to break the storm. Others believe it was based on a belief that sound could physically disperse clouds, a theory as optimistic as it is unverified. Eventually, it fell out of favor largely because people kept getting electrocuted. Children were especially unsettled during storms. Parents often kept them close, huddling the entire family under the driest part of the roof, not for comfort, but for proximity. If something went wrong, at least everyone was together. It was a nightly game of storm or judgment day in wealthier homes. The experience was slightly better. More solid walls, sometimes tiled or leaded windows, and better roofing meant less immediate exposure. But even then, thunder still rumbled through the stone. No one was immune to the sounds of divine disapproval with atmospheric bass. There's a delightful oddity in the written record some monks described weather using emotional terms. The sky groaned with sorrow. One wrote, "Heaven cracked with rage," said another. These weren't poets, they were weather reporters. Because even to the educated, weather was less a system and more a conversation with God, who might be slightly disappointed in your harvest output. And of course, people blamed witches. Storms that destroyed crops or caused sleepless nights were often attributed to someone hexing the skies. If a storm rolled in right after you rejected your neighbor's oatcakes, suspicious. Did the clouds open up the same week Marjorie got a new cat? Very suspicious. Storms were atmospheric courtrooms, and accusations flew as fast as the wind. Oddly enough, storms also inspired intimacy. There are scattered accounts of couples saying their first prayers together during a bad night storm, of families inventing lullabies to calm kids during thunder, of neighbors letting strangers sleep over when it was too dangerous to walk home. The sky might have been furious, but down below, people pulled closer. And what about dreams during storms? Many claimed they were more vivid, charged with symbolism. A dream during a storm was considered doubly meaningful. Rain and lightning were seen as signs of transformation or divine revelation. Or, less glamorously, as you probably shouldn't have eaten that dried fish before bed. Despite the fear, there was also awe. People watched storms from open windows, described lightning in letters, and wove thunder into songs. Even if you didn't understand meteorology, you understood majesty. Nature wasn't just background noise, it was a reminder that the world was big, dangerous, and weirdly poetic. So next time you're safe inside, cozy under your comforter with the hum of central heating, and you hear the soft drumming of rain on the roof, pause for a second. You're hearing what medieval people once heard as God's breath, whispered sideways through your ceiling. And if you happen to dream of goats on fire or talking clouds, maybe just don't tell your priest. The moon is high, the air is thick, and you're sweating into your straw mattress like a soggy loaf of barley bread. No, this isn't some punishment for your sins, it's just summer in medieval Europe, where the only thing worse than sleeping through a thunderstorm was sleeping through a heat wave. You see, for all the romantic fog we throw over the Middle Ages torches, castles, dramatic cloaks, people still had to deal with the most stubborn force on earth, weather that doesn't care how tired you are. And when the heat rolled in, sleep became less about rest and more about survival. Let's start with the obvious. There was no air conditioning, not even a medieval equivalent. No fans, no cooling stones, no popsicles unless you counted licking river ice in winter, and dreaming about it in July. Homes were built for insulation, not ventilation. Thick walls kept out the cold, but trapped heat like a very judgmental oven. Add a roof made of sun-soaked thatch or tile, and by evening, your attic bedroom was practically a slow cooker for humans. So what did people do? Well, they suffered, but creatively. First, they changed their sleeping locations. If your bed was in a loft or upper room common in colder seasons, you moved to the ground floor. Warm air rises, and medieval people, even without thermometers, figured this out fast. Sleeping in kitchens, halls, or even cellars became normal in hotter months. Was it a little damp? Yes. Were there spiders? Also yes. But it beat melting into your own mattress. In cities, some people took to sleeping on rooftops or balconies, wrapping themselves in linen sheets soaked in cool water, which, by the way, dried in 5 minutes and left you damp, grumpy, and bitten by something with too many legs, but again beats the heat. Rural folks, especially farmers, often slept outdoors during summer. Haylofts, barn floors, or shaded spots under trees became temporary bedrooms. It wasn't just about comfort, it was necessity. After a long day of sun-baked labor, the thought of climbing into a heat-trapping cottage was unbearable. You found the breeze, claimed a patch of grass, and hoped the sheep didn't step on you in the night. And yes, sheep did that. Frequently. Now, what about clothing? Contrary to fantasy films, most medieval people didn't wear 14 layers of wool to bed. In the summer, they stripped down to the bare minimum. Linen shifts, breeches, or nothing at all if you could get away with it. Sleeping naked wasn't considered sinful. It was considered logical. Though in shared households, you probably kept on enough fabric to avoid uncomfortable breakfast conversations. Another survival tactic, nighttime schedules. In especially hot regions, people shifted their entire routine. They worked early in the morning, napped during the brutal midday hours, and stayed up late into the evening, eating and socializing once the air cooled down. Midnight might not have been bedtime. It might have been family dinner or goat wrangling hour. Some communities even observed seasonal summer sleep customs. In Italy, people invented versions of la siesta centuries before it became formalized. In parts of Spain and southern France, courtyard sleeping became an art, families laying out mats and pillows under pergolas, fanning one another and telling stories as the stars crept in. One weird little fact: people sometimes hung damp sheets in front of open windows, hoping the breeze would cool the air as it passed through. Did it work, kind of? Mostly, it just made the room smell like wet laundry. But again, creative suffering. Academic debates still swirl around how widespread these adaptations were. Some historians argue that only the wealthy could afford things like multiple sleeping areas or access to cellars. Others believe even peasants found small ways to beat the heat, like wetting their feet before bed, or wrapping hot bricks in cloth and soaking them in cold water to use as makeshift coolers. And then there were herbal tricks. People placed mint, lavender, or chamomile under pillows not just for smell, but for their supposed cooling properties. You might even sleep with a sprig of sage behind your ear if you were particularly desperate or especially gullible. Let's not forget about the bugs. Summer heat brought fleas, lice, and mosquitoes, all of which turned an already miserable night into a full-blown medieval rave. Some people slept under gauze-like nets or tucked tight into linen to avoid bites. Others burned herbs to create smoke clouds that kept insects at bay, and also guaranteed a throat full of rosemary-flavored coughing. Now, one persistent myth is that medieval people just slept less in summer. That's not entirely true. They slept differently, more fragmented. They might nap during the day, wake at night to catch cooler air, or trade hours of sleep for hours of rest. It wasn't about being tired. It was about not baking like a communal bread loaf in your own bed. And in monasteries, sleep schedules stayed strict, but the monks suffered in silence. They continued their midnight prayers, roasting in wool robes, possibly hallucinating psalms halfway through. Some records suggest monks quietly soaked their hoods in cool water before bed, a rare allowance in their otherwise unforgiving routine. Even literature reflects this sweaty struggle. Summer nights were described as sleepless hours of sticky stillness, or air so thick it pulled breath back into the throat. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's just what sleeping through July felt like when your pillow was a burlap sack and your fan was a guy named Martin waving a palm frond. So the next time your AC goes out and you toss and turn, remember your medieval ancestors were doing the exact same thing, minus the ice water, the pajamas, and the social decency not to scream out loud. They endured the night by finding shade, fanning their limbs, and begging for a breeze that never came. And in the morning, they got up, wiped the sweat from their brows, and complained about it. Just like you. It's around midnight. The moon is heavy, the air is still, and the house creaks with that slow, ominous rhythm that only exists when everyone else is asleep. You roll over and realize someone is standing next to the bed. Except they're not really awake. Their eyes are open. Their mouth is moving. But they're not with you. You've just met a medieval sleepwalker, also known as someone probably cursed, possibly possessed, and definitely about to knock over a candlestick. In the Middle Ages, sleepwalking was terrifying. Not because people understood it as a neurological event, no. That would have been too simple. Instead, it was seen as a spiritual anomaly, something unnatural, something, perhaps, demonic. Or at least suspicious enough that people started whispering about night spirits and unquiet minds. There wasn't even a proper word for sleepwalking in many European languages until much later. In Latin, it was sometimes called somnambulismus, literally sleepwalking, but even that term didn't show up consistently. More often, people described the act with whatever terrifying metaphor came to mind: moon-led, ghost-ridden, or moving like a puppet of the devil. Cheery stuff. Historians still debate how widespread this fear was. Some argue that medieval folk were surprisingly tolerant, writing off sleepwalking as just one of those things. Others suggest that cases were hidden, feared, or interpreted as supernatural signs. If you lived in a small village and were caught wandering at night in your shift, eyes glazed, muttering about invisible bees, well, good luck getting invited to market day again. And here's where things get weirder. Some people treated sleepwalkers like prophets. A sleepwalker who spoke in Latin or quoted scripture was often believed to be channeling divine messages. Yes, even if they normally couldn't read or speak Latin. Especially then. Divine possession was considered a legit possibility. And what better way to prove it than shouting Bible verses while trying to climb onto the roof? Spiritual interpretation was a double-edged sword. If you said the right things, you might be seen as holy. If you said the wrong things, like cursing, speaking in tongues, or naming suspicious neighbors congratulations, you just became a candidate for exorcism. Church records contain references to people being troubled by nocturnal wanderings. In some cases, priests were called in to bless the bed, the house, or the person themselves. Holy water was sprinkled, prayers recited, and if the problem continued, more drastic steps were taken, like making the sleepwalker sleep with a relic under their pillow, or in one wild case, inside a chalk circle drawn with a consecrated sword. Note, this is not recommended by modern sleep clinics. It wasn't always seen as evil, though. In some rural communities, sleepwalkers were feared more for the trouble they might cause than for spiritual reasons. People worried about open flames. You could walk into a candle, knock over the family oil lamp, or step on the cat and cause chaos. Some families tied bells to the foot of the bed, or gently restrained chronic sleepwalkers with rope, a soft kind, not the dungeon kind. And if you were a kid, the reactions varied. Children sleepwalking were sometimes treated with tenderness, poor dear, troubled by dreams. Other times, with full-blown panic, the devil is trying to steal his soul. Some mothers rubbed herbal ointments on their children's feet to weigh them down. Others made them sleep next to a sibling with excellent kicking aim. One particularly odd practice involved writing protective psalms on scraps of parchment and sewing them into the sleeper's clothing. It sounds extreme, but the logic was clear if the soul was wandering during sleep. Maybe it just needed a holy map back to the body. Medieval spirituality was weirdly practical sometimes. Now, what did people think caused sleepwalking? There were a few theories: bad humors, especially too much black bile. This was thought to cause melancholy, weird dreams, and nocturnal restlessness. Overeating particularly rich or spicy food. A big meal before bed could heat the blood, sending it straight to your brain and making your legs get ideas. Lunar influence: many believed that the full moon stirred the fluids of the body, especially in those with sensitive minds. This is where the connection to lunacy and moon madness started to form. Academic sources from the 13th and 14th centuries mention all of these, often with a casual shrug that essentially reads, "We don't really get it either." But they knew it was weird, and weird things, in the medieval world, were either holy, cursed, or about to get someone in trouble. In monasteries, sleepwalking was handled with confused dignity. A monk caught wandering the cloister at night might be questioned gently, sent to confession, or offered stronger wine at dinner. You didn't shame someone for it, not outright. But if they started rearranging candles or quoting Revelations backwards, yeah, time to bring in Brother Alphonse with the backup incense. And here's a little-known fact: some people encouraged sleepwalking. No, really. In rare cases, if someone believed their dreams were prophetic, they might try to induce a trance-like state. They'd fast, pray, deprive themselves of sleep, and hope for a holy revelation. Think of it as a medieval TED Talk, except unconscious and possibly pantsless. Over time, the fear of sleepwalking faded into curiosity. By the Renaissance, scholars began recording it as a natural phenomenon, odd, yes, but not inherently cursed. Physicians started linking it to melancholy temperaments and inner turmoil rather than devils and witches. But for centuries before that shift, to sleepwalk was to straddle two worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the conscious and the mysterious. You weren't just walking in your sleep. You were walking the line between safety and suspicion, between the known and the night. So if you've ever found yourself standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with no idea how you got there, be grateful. At least no one's calling for the holy water. It's dark. The kind of dark that makes your own fingers feel like strangers. You're nestled into scratchy linen. just beginning to sink into something that resembles rest. When dong, the church bell sounds, not once, not twice, repeatedly, and from across the cottage, someone mutters, "Storm's close," another whispers, or worse. Welcome to the chaos of medieval nighttime, where bells, banshees, and barnyard drama could ruin even the best attempts at sleep. Let's start with the bells, because these weren't your quaint ding-dong, time for tea affairs. Medieval bells were loud, frequent, and often rang for reasons that would keep you staring at your thatch ceiling in sweaty confusion. First, there were the canonical hours, monasteries, and often entire towns built around them. Rang bells for prayer throughout the day and night, matins around 2 or 3 lauds just before dawn. These bells weren't optional background noise. They were meant to wake everyone, everywhere, and remind them that sleep was a temporary indulgence. Even outside monasteries, town bells rang for curfews, fires, deaths, storms, royal births, escaped pigs, and bad omens. If you heard bells at an unexpected time, it meant something important, or at least dramatic, was happening. The idea was that bells pierced the veil between heaven and earth, alerting both the living and the divine. But bells weren't the only sound intruding on your sleep. Enter the banshees, or at least their European cousins, across Britain and Ireland especially. People believed that eerie wailing at night might not just be the wind. It might be a supernatural cry, a forewarning of death. The term banshee would become popular later, but the idea of death-haunting cries was well known. If you heard a woman sobbing outside your window at night and there was no one there, you might light a candle and pray hard, or crawl under your bed and hope she wasn't there too. The academic community still debates the origins of this belief. Some say it was rooted in actual animals, foxes, owls, even wild cats that produced haunting sounds. Others argue it was born from human grief and projection. Either way, hearing a banshee-like wail in the dark could set your house into full panic mode. Prayers, salt lines at the doorway, and checking on every relative under your roof became standard response. Speaking of animals, barnyard chaos was a nightly feature. You may think of medieval nights as quiet and pastoral, but that's only if you've never tried to sleep next to a donkey who disagrees with the moon. Farm animals didn't clock out at sundown. They scratched, brayed, flapped, and sometimes even broke out of their pens, causing nocturnal livestock parades that required immediate, half-asleep human intervention. Dogs barked, roosters crowed early, goats made their opinions known on just about everything. If you lived in close quarters with your animals and most people did, your bedtime soundtrack was more barn than lullaby. Roosters were especially obnoxious. Contrary to myth, they didn't only crow at sunrise, they crowed whenever they felt like it. Midnight sure. 2:37 a.m., even better. Some people actually relied on their inconsistency to mark time during the night. Others just threw things in their general direction. One weird little tradition involved cursing or bargaining with animals to get some sleep. A farmer might whisper, "Just hush tonight and I'll give you the good grain tomorrow," as though reasoning with a chicken were a viable strategy. Desperate times. Desperate poultry diplomacy. There was also a very real fear of nighttime omens. If you heard 3 knocks on your door at midnight and no one was there, bad sign. If a cat stared at the wall and hissed during a storm, definitely a ghost. If your candle flickered without a breeze, someone was dying. Medieval people saw the night as a constant conversation between the physical and the supernatural, and every creak, gust, and grunt had potential meaning. Even dreams were considered part of this nocturnal language. If you woke suddenly with your heart racing, it wasn't just indigestion. It might be a divine warning or demonic mischief. Either way, you were probably advised to say a prayer, sprinkle some holy water, and sleep on your other side. And let's not forget about the actual humans making noise. Drunk neighbors singing their way home from the tavern, disputes spilling into the streets, or watchmen shouting the hour it was a noisy, unpredictable world. Walls were thin, streets echoed, privacy was imaginary. Even wealthy townhouses had windows open to the night air, and you'd often hear entire conversations through stone and wood. In fact, some communities developed nighttime codes to manage this. Certain knocks meant friend, certain bell rings meant fire, certain chants meant go back to bed. It's just wind. But in less organized areas, people just learned to live with it, a symphony of real and imagined noises, both mundane and mystical. There's one particularly delightful account of a 14th century woman who was convinced a ghost was rattling her shutters each night. After 3 weeks of disrupted sleep, a neighbor finally discovered the culprit, a very determined squirrel. And while that sounds hilarious to us now, to her, it had been a spiritual crisis. Which brings us to the truth of medieval night. No one really slept soundly. Between bells, beasts, spirits, dreams, storms, and your cousin Jeffrey's snoring, sleep came in pieces. You adapted, you accepted it, and you developed rituals to cope. You muttered protective rhymes. You lit candles in certain patterns. You hung amulets above the bed or tucked blessed bread under the mattress. You covered mirrors, closed shutters with prayers, and arranged shoes in specific directions, because why not if chaos reigned? At least your feet were spiritually protected. So the next time a siren, a creaky pipe, or a mysterious three-a-bum thud wakes you up and sends you into a moment of panic, just remember you're part of a long, sleepless tradition. Your ancestors didn't rest easy. They rested alert, and sometimes they got up and yelled at their donkey. You're lying in bed, probably with 3 relatives, 2 chickens, and a questionable draft sneaking under the door. The fire's burned low. Your feet are just starting to warm, and then there's a creak, soft footsteps, a door latch shifting. Not the wind, not a goat. Someone is awake, and it's a woman. Now, in modern terms, that's not exactly a dramatic sentence, but in the Middle Ages, a woman moving through the house at night could mean a dozen different things, and most of them scared the life out of people. Because powerful women, and especially those who moved around in the dark, were often treated with a blend of awe, suspicion, and outright fear. It wasn't just superstition, it was cultural, political, and deeply tangled in the weird nocturnal anxieties of the era. Nighttime, remember, was liminal space, dangerous, undefined. So when women entered it, society got nervous. Let's start with noble women. While you might think queens and duchesses were tucked into 4-poster beds surrounded by perfumed silk and harp music, many had agendas that stretched well past sundown. Royal courts didn't sleep at sunset. In fact, a huge amount of plotting, letter writing, private meetings, and subtle manipulation happened after hours, especially when the men were too drunk to notice. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance. She was one of the most powerful women of the 12th century Queen of France, then England, mother of kings, and chronic late-night schemer. Contemporary chroniclers couldn't decide whether to admire or fear her. She was educated, politically savvy, and very much in charge, which, to many male writers of the time, read as probably a little dangerous. There are whispers of Eleanor arranging secret meetings in her private chambers lit by candlelight, full of hushed voices and hard decisions. Was she planning revolts, negotiating deals? Possibly both. And if her enemies didn't like it, they often defaulted to the same accusation. She's a woman who doesn't sleep when she's supposed to, which, in medieval terms, meant witchcraft was on the table. And speaking of witches, you knew we'd get here. Women who spent time alone at night were often labeled wise women or night workers, depending on who you asked. That might mean midwives, herbalists, or healers. Or it might mean someone's grandmother who happened to own a lot of cats and knew too much about mushrooms. The point is, these women were useful during the day but suspect at night. Because night, to the medieval mind, was the time when good Christians slept. Anyone awake was either protecting the town or getting into trouble. And that suspicion wasn't limited to the poor. Even women in convents could inspire scandal. Abbesses, female leaders of religious communities, had enormous power. Some controlled land, money, and local politics. A few even defied bishops. And when they were accused of misusing their influence, it often came with nighttime imagery, secret candlelit rituals, strange chanting, hidden messages passed through doors at midnight, real or imagined. It all smelled of she's up to something. Historians still argue about how much of this was real. Did powerful women actually use the night to maneuver politically, spiritually, and socially? Absolutely. Did people freak out because of it? Also absolutely. The academic term is gendered nocturnal anxiety. The less academic version is, she's awake and clever, so now we're scared. One little known fact. Women were often the ones awake to care for the dying, because death liked to visit at night. And women, especially older ones, were usually the ones called to keep vigil, whisper prayers, or tend to the body. This gave them a strange power. They were the ones who watched as souls left, who guided the living through grief, who moved through that thin space between the mortal and the divine. And that role came with danger. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, and a woman had been there, people might assume she'd helped it along, especially if she also made herbal tea. Now, let's travel to the countryside. In smaller villages, widows were often seen as both vulnerable and dangerous, alone in their homes. They were independent, socially untethered. That freedom made them hard to control, and the fact that they didn't answer to husbands or fathers made some people deeply uncomfortable. Add in a few pets and a nighttime candle, and suddenly you were looking at prime witch trial material. There are cases, real ones, of women being accused of sorcery because they were seen wandering at night with no clear reason. One woman was condemned for simply walking to the well at dusk. Another for leaving bread on a windowsill at a strange hour. The assumption was simple: if you're awake when decent people are sleeping, you're probably doing something unholy. And yet many of these women weren't witches. They were survivors, running households, healing the sick, staying up with crying babies, watching the fire, or preparing the next day's bread. The night was dangerous, yes, but it was also full of opportunity, if you knew how to move through it. There's even evidence that female-led nocturnal communities existed, groups of women who gathered in homes after dark for quiet socializing, mutual aid, or whispered prayer. No records of spellcasting, just talk, sewing, maybe sharing news. But if discovered, Those groups were sometimes broken up, accused of secret plots or pagan revival. Why? Because unmonitored female solidarity after bedtime was scarier than any ghost. So while medieval men roamed the night as guards, drunkards, or thieves, women who walked after dark were often charged with cosmic mischief. That didn't stop them. But it did mean they walked carefully, quietly, knowing that every creaking floorboard might lead to accusation, not applause. So the next time you stay up too late, maybe sipping tea or scrolling in the dark, think of them, the abbess with her ink-stained hands, the widow by the hearth, the healer watching for omens, the queen who never really slept. Not witches, not villains, just women in the dark, wide awake while the world pretended to dream. The fire has burned out, the animals have mostly settled, and the hour is late, too late. You're jolted awake by the sound of something sharp, not the wind, not a goat this time, something human. You squint toward the shutters, and in the faint moonlight, you see it, a figure, moving just a little too carefully. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the middle of a medieval crime scene. Night in the Middle Ages was not just for sleeping, it was a time of opportunity for criminals, both bold and extremely bad at stealth. And because the darkness held more than just ghosts and storm clouds, entire communities developed a deeply complicated relationship with after-hours justice. Let's start with the basics. There were no real police forces. The idea of trained, uniformed, night patrolling professionals wouldn't exist for centuries. Instead, towns relied on combinations of watchmen, constables, local militias, and angry neighbors with sharp objects. If you were lucky, someone nearby had a torch and a reasonable sense of justice. If not, good luck. Crimes after dark were particularly feared because they were hard to detect, easy to deny, and far more difficult to investigate. If someone stole your boots during the day, you'd notice. If they did it while you were asleep, you'd wake up with cold feet and no idea which of your neighbors was now mysteriously shod. And it wasn't just theft. Medieval laws often treated nighttime crime as more severe than daytime crime. Break into a house during daylight and steal a loaf of bread that might get you a fine. Do it at night, that could get you hanged. Why? Because crime at night was considered more sinister, more premeditated, and somehow more disrespectful to the natural order. There's a wonderful contradiction in the records. People feared the night, but also trusted it to protect them. You'd bar your doors and sleep with a stick under your straw-stuffed pillow. But you'd also assume the darkness kept you hidden, kept your secrets buried in shadow. That illusion shattered when someone came through the shutters. One common concern: candle theft. Yes, really. Candles were expensive. Tallow was valuable. If someone stole your candle, you couldn't just replace it the next day at ye olde convenience store. It meant your nights got longer, your rooms got darker, and your safety felt thinner. So stealing a candle wasn't just petty theft. It was an act of aggression against your ability to live well in the dark. And let's talk about torches. Carrying a torch at night meant you had business. You were either a watchman, a noble, or someone pretending to be important. Because only those with wealth or authority could afford to light the dark, literally. So if you saw someone moving with a torch, and they weren't from around here, that raised questions. Worse still, if someone snuffed out your torch or candle, that was sometimes treated as an assault. The darkness was feared so deeply that being forced into it even for a moment could be interpreted as an act of violence. There's a historical debate over how effective curfews actually were. In many towns, bells rang at sundown, marking the official end of safe hours. After that, you weren't supposed to be outside unless you had a good reason or an even better excuse. Violating curfew could result in fines, public shaming, or being hauled to the local jail, which was likely just a glorified pantry with a lock on it. Yet despite the restrictions, crimes happened. A lot. Burglary, arson, and revenge killings were common offenses under the cover of night. And because homes were small, poorly fortified, and often shared with livestock, it didn't take much to break in. A loose latch, a low window, a door left unbarred because the dog was on watch. Spoiler, the dog was not watching. Some people tried to outsmart nighttime dangers with traps, tripwires, strategically placed pots, or even strings of bells hung near entry points. The medieval burglar's greatest enemy, a clumsy foot and a nosy grandmother. One rare but fascinating tactic involved sleep decoys. Yes, really. Some people placed clothes or hay-filled dummies in their bed to fake occupancy when they had to leave unexpectedly. The idea was to discourage would-be attackers or thieves by making them think someone was already asleep and potentially armed with a very sharp spoon. But sometimes, the criminal was already inside. Household servants, boarders, or guests could easily become culprits. Trust was essential, and betrayal cut deep, especially when you shared your bed with someone who might rob you, or worse, report your secrets to others. Night crimes weren't just about theft, they were about intimacy, betrayal, and visibility. And then there's the uncomfortable truth: many crimes went unpunished. If a theft occurred in the dead of night and there were no witnesses, what could you do? There were no fingerprints, no forensics, no security footage, just gossip, suspicion, and maybe a trial by rumor. People turned to supernatural explanations. A spirit stole it. The devil made them do it. Or my personal favorite, the object simply disappeared into the dark, which, while not very helpful, at least saved someone the effort of blaming their neighbor. That said, justice did happen. Catch a thief in the act, and the punishment was often public and harsh. Stocks, whippings, branding, or banishment. The night was unforgiving, and so were the people who survived it. Ironically, the most common punishment for nighttime crime wasn't physical, it was social. Being known as a creeper of the shadows could ruin your chances at marriage, trade, or even borrowing someone's donkey. Reputation was everything, and the darkness didn't hide you as well as you thought it did. So the next time you're up at 2 maybe tiptoeing to the fridge or scrolling quietly in bed, remember in the Middle Ages, being awake at night meant danger. It meant suspicion. It meant you might be mistaken for a criminal, a ghost, or both. And if you did happen to step outside for a moment, best carry a candle and maybe a very loud song to prove your intentions were honest. After all, nothing says I'm not a thief quite like singing psalms off-key while walking in a straight line. It's nearly dawn. The air feels different now, cooler, lighter, like the world is slowly unclenching its nocturnal fists. Somewhere, a rooster is either heralding the morning or having a personal crisis. Either way, you're awake again, and in the medieval world. This means it's time to slide out of bed, light a taper, and confront the day, but not all at once. First, there's something else happening. The second sleep. Yes, you read that right. In the Middle Ages, people didn't sleep in one big, uninterrupted stretch. Instead, They had what historians now call segmented sleep, a phenomenon so common it was just how things were. You had a first sleep, then a period of midnight wakefulness, and then a second sleep. Not insomnia, not a quirk, just normal. Let's break it down. The first sleep usually began not long after sunset. Remember, artificial light was minimal, candle wax was expensive, oil was precious, and firelight made you smell like smoked turnip. So when darkness fell, so did people. Sleep began early, sometimes as early as 8 p.m., and lasted for about 4 hours. Then around midnight you'd wake up. Not in panic, not because something scared you, just because that's how your brain worked. This in-between time was called the watch or the waking, and it wasn't passive. People used it for all sorts of things: praying, reading if you were literate and rich, checking the animals, smoking out fleas, chatting with your bedmate, or even, let's be honest, some intimate activities. In fact, this period was often considered the ideal time for sex, with medieval medical texts confidently declaring that bodies were more vigorous after the first sleep. So there you go. Some people just lay quietly and thought. Others sat up, tended a fire, or wandered the house with a candle stub and no shoes, which is the most medieval image possible. The silence of that middle night was different. Still, reflective. You weren't tired. Exactly. You were between worlds. Then, after an hour or two, you'd go back to bed and begin your second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This was often the deeper, dream-filled portion of the night, and when the rooster finally got it right and the eastern sky began to pale, you'd rise for good, not groggy, not panicked, just done sleeping. Modern sleep science has since discovered that this pattern is deeply natural. Our circadian rhythms are actually designed to accommodate 2 periods of rest, split by a stretch of alertness. But in our electric-lit, schedule-packed world, we've lost that rhythm. In medieval times, without light bulbs, streaming TV, or caffeine binges, people leaned into it. We know about segmented sleep from letters, court records, religious texts, and even diary entries. People referred to their first sleep and second sleep like we might mention breakfast or lunch. Monks wrote about praying between rests. Peasants mentioned dreams during the second rest. It was so ordinary. No one thought to explain it until it vanished. One little-known fact in some religious communities: waking between sleeps was seen as a spiritual gift. Monks or nuns would rise during the watch and perform private devotions often more heartfelt than the structured prayers of the day. Some even claimed to receive visions or divine messages in this hour. It was considered a thin time, when heaven felt closer and your soul could stretch. Others used the waking period more practically. In households with limited space, people might take turns using the fire during this break, cooking porridge, warming water, or reheating wine. If you wanted warm breakfast at sunrise, the middle of the night was your prep window. It's also when many people addressed domestic worries, checking that animals were still penned, that no embers had escaped the hearth, or that the baby hadn't rolled into a terrifying position on the mattress of straw and misplaced elbows. It was a time to fix things quietly, before the world roared back to life. And here's where things get a little sad. With the rise of industrialization, factory bells, rigid work shifts, and cheap artificial lighting, segmented sleep disappeared. Not because people stopped needing it, but because it stopped being possible. Who had time for 2 sleeps when your boss expected you at the loom by 5 a.m.? Sleep was compressed, forced into one tidy chunk, and waking at night, once normal, was now labeled as disruption. Something to be fixed, medicated, feared. Modern historians and sleep scientists argue that this change may have deep consequences for mental health, dream quality, and general well-being. After all, if your body wants to wake for an hour at night, but your brain panics every time it does, you're in for a long ride on the Anxiety Express. But in the medieval world, that quiet hour was almost gentle. There was no rush, no notifications, no feeling of failure, just a candle, some thoughts, a whispered prayer, maybe a sip of watered wine, and then back to bed. So if you've ever woken up in the dead of night, wide-eyed and wondering what's wrong with you, nothing is wrong. You're just syncing up with the sleep pattern of your ancestors. The only difference, they didn't check their phones. They reached for a cloak and walked outside to stare at the moon. Try it sometime. You might just find a kind of peace that can only be heard between two sleeps. The sky is beginning to shift from indigo to soft gray. A breeze slips under the door, smelling faintly of damp earth and chimney soot. Somewhere, a dog barks without conviction. It's almost morning in the medieval world, and that means one thing: you'd better be up soon, or someone's going to throw a bucket at you. Waking up in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic. There was no gentle harp music, no silk eye masks, no aromatherapy diffusers misting lavender into the room. There was just cold air, sore limbs, and the harsh sound of someone else already stomping around, banging pots or bells, and muttering loudly about lazy bones. Because medieval mornings were aggressive. Life didn't wait. Roosters crowed, cows mooed. Your boss, whether a monk, a lord, or your mother, wanted you doing things. Sleep was a necessity, yes. But waking up, that was a test of character. The earliest risers got the warmest pottage and the least judgment. Let's begin with who woke you up if you weren't already up from sheer obligation. In monasteries, bells were the alarm clocks. Matins might have rung at 2 a.m. But prime morning prayer started just after dawn. The monks moved like whispering shadows, their feet cold against the stone floors. No one wanted to get up, but you did, because God was watching. In towns and villages, there were no bells for ordinary people unless the local church was particularly noisy. You woke with the light, or with the animal chorus. Horses whinnying, pigs complaining, hens squabbling. Farmyards ran on their own chaotic schedule. If you didn't feed them first, they'd make sure you didn't sleep second. In wealthier homes, servants were tasked with waking their employers. Some did it by poking them gently, others, less romantically, opened the shutters and let in the freezing air. There are even records of servants clapping their hands loudly or singing off-key until the noble in question finally groaned awake. Coffee hadn't been invented yet, but annoyance was an effective stimulant. Some of the earliest wake-up services in big towns were knocker-uppers. Yes, that's a real term. Though more common in later centuries, the tradition goes way back. Someone would be hired to walk the streets and knock on doors or windows with a stick, usually for workers who needed to be up before dawn. The job was unofficial, underpaid, and utterly essential. Miss your wake-up, miss your livelihood. Now, once you were awake, you got dressed fast. Not for modesty, your family had already seen everything you owned, but because mornings were cold. Homes didn't have central heating. Your fire probably burned down overnight. So unless someone had gotten up earlier to restart it, and they probably hadn't, You were pulling on your woolen tunic in the same breath you muttered curses at the chill. One weird medieval belief you had to put your shoes on in the correct order, or the whole day might go wrong. Right shoe first, then left. Or was it left then right, depends on the region. But whichever way, the idea was that the act of dressing was almost ritualistic. If you started your day wrong, you opened yourself up to bad luck, or worse, demonic interference. Because yes, even shoes had spiritual implications. And if you didn't get up, let's talk shame. Late sleepers were considered morally suspicious. Idleness was a sin. Sloth, one of the 7 deadlies, often got lumped together with sleeping in. Some sermons warned that oversleeping let demons whisper into your ears. Others just said you'd end up poor and pitiful. Either way, your neighbors would talk. Even literature got in on the roast. Lazy characters were mocked. Heroes were always early risers. Waking early meant you were virtuous, industrious, blessed. Sleeping late, definitely cursed, or French, maybe both. In households with hired laborers, there were often strict rules. If you weren't up by sunrise, you might lose pay, or chores, or if you were a younger sibling, breakfast. Some accounts mention cattle being fed before children, because the cow made milk, the child just ate it. And in monasteries, missing morning prayer could land you in penance. Some monks wore signs around their necks that read dormitator if they were caught napping during prayers. Literal public shaming for oversleeping. Harsh, but undeniably effective. Let's not forget the communal pressure. You didn't sleep alone, and you definitely didn't wake up alone. In one room, you might have 3 adults, 4 children, 2 dogs, and a piglet. Someone was going to be awake and loud before you. And once they were moving, there was no going back to sleep. The medieval world did not believe in 5 more minutes. There's also evidence of preparatory rituals for waking. People sometimes said specific prayers before opening their eyes, like bless this day and guard me from evil, or let me rise in virtue, not sin. It wasn't superstition, it was protection. The idea was that the first thing you did in the morning shaped your whole day. Even breakfast was symbolic. A piece of bread, a sip of ale, maybe a bit of cheese if the cow was generous. No cinnamon rolls, no espresso, just fuel to start work. Because unless you were nobility or clergy, your day began with labor, farming, cooking, scrubbing, mending, chopping, whatever kept your household alive. Academic debate continues over how strictly these routines were enforced. Some historians argue that waking hours were more flexible depending on the season. Others insist that, even in winter, expectations were firm. If the sun was up and you weren't, someone was going to notice and judge. Interestingly, waking up early was tied to survival. Miss the morning market, you miss the best goods. Show up late to the field, you lose daylight. Sleep in too long during harvest, you're the reason the whole village runs out of bread. Time was precious, and the hours before noon were golden. So yes, there were sleepy people in the Middle Ages. There were probably even grumpy ones. But oversleeping wasn't cute or funny, it was a failing, a crack in the moral armor. And in a world where your value was often measured by your output, waking late could cost you dearly. So the next time your alarm rings at 6 a.m. and you're tempted to hit snooze, just remember, in the medieval world, you'd already be milking something by now. And if you weren't, someone would be banging on your shutters with a broom and a Bible. The world is waking now. The sky is threaded with pale gold. A thin curl of smoke rises from a neighbor's chimney. You stretch, groan, maybe scratch your head, and accept reluctantly that the day has begun. Another night survived, another dawn earned. But before you dive into the chaos of chores, sermons, and livestock maintenance, there's one final ritual to complete the medieval morning routine. No skincare, no yoga, no podcasts, just survival with a little side of soul maintenance. Let's begin in the home. You rise from your lumpy mattress, probably stuffed with straw, moss, or old fabric, and immediately look for your shoes. Why? Because the floor is cold, possibly muddy, and statistically guaranteed to contain at least one dead insect, or sibling, or spoon. Next, you might make your bed not out of cleanliness, but out of superstition. An unmade bed was thought to invite demons, illness, or worst of all, neighbors who would notice and then talk. Plus, tidying your sleeping space was symbolic. Night is over, order returns, and your linen no longer hides the things you whispered into it. Then came the face wash. No bathroom, no plumbing, just a basin of cold water if you were lucky, or a quick splash from a bucket. Soap rare and often made from unpleasant ingredients. More likely, you wiped your face with a damp cloth or just slapped water on it like someone trying to survive both the hangover and the 14th century at the same time. Teeth. Yes. You might rub them with a cloth, salt, or even herbs like sage or mint. Not because you cared about plaque, you didn't know what that was, but because breath that could kill a chicken at 10 paces was a spiritual problem. Some believed that unclean breath could carry sin. Others just didn't want to be blamed for breakfast going bad. Then there was the business of blessing the day. Religious or not, most people began with some kind of spoken or whispered prayer. Something like, "Bless this day," or "Protect me from evil," or "Please don't let the pig get loose again." You might cross yourself, light a taper, or say a line you didn't fully understand, but had heard your grandmother mutter every morning since forever. And yes, superstition played a heavy role. Step out of bed with your right foot first. Don't sneeze before your first word. Don't look into a mirror until you've said a prayer, if you even owned a mirror, which you probably didn't. Morning routines were full of these small, almost unconscious actions, half habit, half charm against the unpredictable world. Breakfast came next, but don't imagine pancakes or smoothies. No one was Instagramming their medieval meals. A typical peasant breakfast was dark bread and small beer, yes. Beer with maybe some cheese if you were fancy, or porridge if oats were available. No sugar, no variety, just fuel. Monks, on the other hand, often fasted through the morning, eating only after their first set of prayers and labor. Nobles had it better, sometimes eating warm dishes, meat, eggs, pastries, but not in bed. Breakfast in bed was not a thing, mostly because beds were small, cold, and already crowded. Then came bodily business. Latrines were often shared, external and freezing. Chamber pots were common, but someone had to empty them, and that someone was often you. If you lived in a wealthier home, there might be a designated person to handle waste. Otherwise, you walked it out, tossed it in the ditch, and hoped the wind blew the other way. Dressing was quick and practical. You didn't have 10 outfits. You had 2 if you were lucky. You put on what was cleanish and warmish. Layering was survival. Laces and buttons were rare ties. Pins and sheer determination did most of the work. Women often covered their hair with veils or wimples. Men belted tunics or hose. No fashion blogs. but plenty of judgment if your hem was too short or your coif was crooked. For those who worked land or livestock, the morning wasn't a gentle ramp-up. You were expected to be moving with the sun, feeding animals, hauling water, preparing tools. Children were involved early. Even the youngest carried kindling, fetched eggs, or swatted geese out of the yard. Leisure didn't exist until the work was done, and even then, it looked suspicious. And let's not forget community sounds. Morning in a medieval town meant bells, roosters, vendors setting up carts, blacksmiths hammering, the splash of buckets in wells, and the occasional shouted argument over whose goat ate whose cabbage. The world woke up loudly, and you were swept along in its noise. Some communities also had public gatherings first thing, especially on market days or feast days. The town crier might announce news. Notices were read aloud. Sometimes, punishments were carried out at dawn, both as a warning and a way to clear the calendar before lunch. One weird tradition. Some households believed that the first words spoken each day mattered. If you started your day with a blessing, good things might follow. Start with a complaint. You invited bad fortune. There are recorded instances of families greeting each other with lines like, "God keep us from harm," before saying anything else, just in case someone was listening. Someone supernatural. Academic sources suggest that the line between spiritual routine and practical preparation was blurry. Waking up wasn't just a physical act. It was a renewal of your contract with the day. You weren't guaranteed a tomorrow. So each morning was a kind of mini resurrection. That's why you prayed. That's why you washed. That's why you muttered something about your left shoe and your dreams. And when you finally stepped outside, you did it with hope and hesitation. Because in the Middle Ages, the world could change fast. One morning you're baking bread. The next, a plague cart rolls through town. So every sunrise was both a beginning and a gamble. So now, as you pull yourself out of bed, grumble toward your coffee, and squint at your inbox, take a moment. You're following a long, strange, sacred tradition. People have been stumbling into consciousness for centuries, barefoot, blinking, and mildly annoyed. The medieval morning was full of noises, smells, little rituals, and quiet dread. In other words, not so different from yours. The fire has long gone out. The shutters are drawn tight. And the wind outside is softer now, just a whisper slipping through old wood. The day is behind us, again. You've seen it through medieval eyes, mud-caked boots, candlelit prayers, night sweats, whispered dreams, and all. You've walked through the long, creaking corridors of the past, through thunder and fever, laughter and fear. You've shared a straw bed with goats, listened to suspiciously loud chickens, and tried not to breathe too deeply next to Uncle Bartholomew and his ale breath. And all along the way, you've learned a secret most history books forget to mention. People back then were tired, constantly, like us. They didn't always understand the world around them, but they understood how to keep moving through it, one sleepless night at a time. They prayed, they laughed, they suffered, they loved, and somehow they slept, in patches, in shifts, in stolen hours between storms and sins. Now the lights are low again. Maybe you've got a soft blanket, or the gentle buzz of a fan nearby. Maybe it's 3 a.m. and your brain is still wide awake. That's okay. Let it be. Close your eyes when you're ready, not because you have to, but because you can. You're not huddled under a leaky roof. You're not hoping the rooster oversleeps. You're safe, now, on the other side of time. So breathe a little deeper. Let your limbs go heavy. The past will keep spinning. Quietly, behind the scenes. The monks will light their candles, the banshees will wander the fog, and the baker will wake before dawn, just like always. But you can rest. Sleep well, dream strange, and know that even in history's darkest hours, someone was always keeping the fire going. End of script. Sleep well.